wait. Hey, Rhonda.
Hi, I'm
How you
just
doing?
typing in a little note. We will admit you, let me see.
Just say it's 7 o'clock, and then can you make me co-host so I can make sure to, oh, you already hit recording?
Pardon me?
Did you already hit recording?
I didn't hit it.
That's so
Is there a
weird.
way to stop from recording right now?
Yeah, so give me a second. I'm gonna stop it right now. Well, can you make me co-host and then I'll
You
stop it?
already are.
I am? Okay, so I'm
Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to the third series from Dr. Robert Watson. And on behalf of the Friends of the Stirling Road Library, we are delighted to welcome you and Dr. Watson to this series. This is a three-part series which will feature discussions on, as you know, today's topic is Truman and Israel, a behind-the-scenes look at statehood in 1948. Monday, September 13th is ranking the presidents, best to worst, and all the rest. And on Wednesday, October 6th, Dr. Watson and I will discuss his just released book, Escape, the story of Confederacy's infamous Libby prison and the Civil War's largest jail escape. As you know, this series is being sponsored by the Friends. And if you're not a member and you want to find out more about the Friends of the Stirling Road Library, and as well as membership and upcoming programs, please go to our website at stirlingfriends.org. This presentation will be approximately 1 hour with questions and answers to follow. Please keep yourselves muted and submit your questions via the chat at the end of the presentation. And as I mentioned, these presentations are being recorded and will be available on the Friends website tomorrow. And I'm so delighted to again introduce Dr. Robert Watson. He's an exceptional and distinguished scholar, and he's an award-winning author, historian, political commentator, and community leader who currently serves as Distinguished Professor of American History and Avron Fogelman Research Professor at Lynn University in Boca. Please just mute yourself if you're not muted. Thank you. In addition to being a professor and author, Dr. Watson is a frequent media commentator and activist who founded 3 nonprofit think tanks dedicated to civic education, political reform, and fact-checking political campaigns. Dr. Watson is a visiting scholar, and he's been to dozens of historic sites, museums, universities, including the Truman and Ford Presidential Libraries, West Point, the National Archives, Smithsonian Institute, just to name a few. Dr. Watson also regularly lectures at libraries, museums, luxury cruises, historic sites, and lifelong learning institutes. At this time, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Robert Watson. It's all yours, Dr. Watson.
Thanks, Rhonda. And importantly, I also lecture for the Friends of the Stirling Road Library.
Yes.
Okay. So, and yeah, this is my third series with you. So it's my pleasure. I have been lecturing. I'm a bibliophile and I always support my local libraries. I've lectured for my local libraries my entire 31-year career. I actually started lecturing at my local libraries when I was in grad school. So it pushes it past probably 35 years. And I've lectured at probably 2-3 dozen libraries around Florida. But I think I've lectured more with now the Stirling Road than any other library. So I did 3 or 4 with Boca, 3 or 4 with Delray, but you guys are up to 7. So I'm quite certain after this series, you'll be more than done with me. Let me just quick give a shout out. I was trying to flip through. If I miss any of you, I apologize. I saw a couple of my buddies. I saw Dr. Stewart looking good, losing a lot of weight. I saw Willow, my niece. I saw Les and Linda, Marilyn, Jack and Janet. And of course, Karen is on board. So So, and if something happens to me halfway through the lecture, I fall asleep because of my severe sleep deprivation for not sleeping all week, Karen Deku can just take over my lecture. So I'm glad she's on for that. Enough of that blah, blah, blah. Let me share my screen and we'll get into my lecture. There we go. Can you all see that okay? Rhonda, Hannah,
Yes, it's good.
Marilyn. So again, thanks to Rhonda, Hannah, and Marilyn and the Friends of the Stirling Road Library. I encourage all of you to join and support your local libraries. Times like this, we really need our local libraries who do so much more than just provide books. There's classes on other languages and there's enrichment programs and there's lectures and it's a community resource. So I've always been a library nerd and a real bibliophile. So this lecture tonight, it's one of I have 100 different lectures I give. And this is absolutely one of my all-time favorite ones for a couple of reasons. Number one, Harry Truman's my hero. So any excuse to talk about Harry Truman, I'm good to go. But, you know, these days with the political dysfunction and gridlock, it's so easy to be cynical about our politics, where, you know, maybe one of our two parties is an obstructionist party rather than a governing party. It's so easy to be so cynical. It's also easy to be cynical, or if not flat out depressed or worried about the state of Israel, given so much that has happened in the last few years and is happening now. Moreover, a number of organizations from the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, to the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Brennan Center, the FBI, Trinity College, have all documented an alarming spike for about 5 years now, an unprecedented spike. And they've been doing studies since the 60s, an unprecedented spike of anti-Semitic violence starting around 2016, 2017. And it's all across the country, microaggressions towards college students, attacks on Jews, swastikas spray painted on synagogues, hateful KKK type of literature being distributed on college campuses, boycotts of Israel, Jewish cemeteries being desecrated. It's really quite alarming. So amidst all of that, I find myself always falling back on this story because it's a story with a happy ending. And it's a story about moral courage. And it's a story about one person making a difference. And it's also a story about perhaps the least likely person you ever would have thought would be a great champion for someone, in this case, the Jewish community, who in fact is that. So this is the story of Harry Truman and the improbable founding of Israel in 1948. So before I jump into the story, I want to talk just a little bit about my buddy Harry and about his upbringing. So about 25 years ago, I started a 5-6 year project. And that is I identified first off, and then rounded up every single living advisor, secretary, general, speechwriter, lawyer who worked for Harry Truman. And over the course of several years, I conducted rounds, plural, of intensive interviews with them to try to flesh out and get a sense of who Truman was. A lot of you are familiar with the Shoah Foundation, the work where we tape oral history interviews of Holocaust survivors, right, everybody? And make those available in the Holocaust Museum and so forth. I've done those, but I've also done these with Truman aides and made them available in the Truman Presidential Library. So just to give you an idea what a mensch this guy is and just his personality, here's a quick story or two, and then I'll jump into his upbringing. So I found one of Truman's former secretaries. Her name was Wanda. And believe it or not, she was living in Sarasota. So I called her and said I wanted to interview her. And would that be okay? She said, of course. So I said, I'll drive over. So I drove over and, oh, she was so cute. She made me a cake. And she was wearing all this like 1940s campaign, the flat hat with the buttons all over it. She had a loud Truman sweater. She was an adorable little bubby. And I walked in and I said to her, you know, listen, I don't know if you've ever done an interview. I just want you to relax. And this is what she said to me. She said, I want you to remember one thing. This is around the time of Monica Lewinsky and that scandal. She said, I was Truman's secretary, not his intern. It's sort of like having your bubby tell you about the birds and bees. I was like, okay, that's too much information. So I told her, I said, while I'm setting up the camera, I want you to just take a deep breath, have a seat at the table, pretend the camera's not there. Let's just talk. While I'm setting it up, tell me a story. And this is the one she told me. She said there were Truman had his main secretary, but then he had a group of a couple of young women. Wanda was probably 19 or 20. And she said, we sat way off to the side in an anteroom. And our job was to answer the phone back when you had to be an operator and type letters, that kind of thing. And she said one day in this busy complex of aides and the bustling environment of the White House, she said, I brought a new photograph of my little son. I don't remember his name and how old he was now, but let's say his name was John and he was 3. I don't know. She said, I brought this photograph of my baby in and I put it on my desk. And she said, a little while later, Truman comes walking by in this mass office complex of noise and chaos and important things happening. She said, I'm sitting there working. I look over like I always do, because we always want to eyeball the president. You always want to see the president. Then she says, as I'm turning back to get back to my work, I hear from across the room the president yell, Wanda. And she said, I almost fell out of my chair. How would this guy even know my name, right? And she said, yes, Mr. President. And he says, is that a new photograph on your desk? And she said, I couldn't believe he noticed. She said, yes. He says, well, who is it? She said, my son. He says, well, what's his name? She says, John. He said, well, tell me about John. How old is he? She said, he's 3. Well, he's not 3. He'll be 3 in another 9 weeks on November 5th or whatever. And she said, he laughed and said, well, tell him that Harry said hi. And then he went in his office. And she thought, oh my gosh. Well, you all know where I'm going with this story, right? Absolutely, Karen. 9 weeks later, she said, Truman comes walking by and he stops in the middle of the Marshall Plan, NATO, World War II. She said he stops and across the room he yells, Wanda, today's John's birthday. Tell him that Harry said happy birthday. And he walked into his office. And she said, I almost fell out of my chair, but then she said, I thought about it. And she said, that was Harry Truman. It was just Harry being Harry. Just common as the day is long, utterly unaffected by power and his success. He told his aides, call me Harry, just as common as the day is long. One of his aides was Dr. Ken Heckler, a famous professor from Princeton. And Ken was the last living senior aide to go. He passed at 102, 103, and he became kind of a mentor to me. And I probably spent about 20 years visiting with Ken and having him down on campus and really learned an awful lot about, he worked for Roosevelt and Truman. I was blessed to have such a mentor as this remarkable man. And he met Eleanor Roosevelt, Churchill. I mean, this guy was the Forrest Gump of history, right? He met everybody. Dr. Heckler told me one day, he said, I was very depressed at a meeting. It was a speech writing meeting. Dr. Heckler was one of President Roosevelt and then President Truman's speechwriters. He said, I was, a death in the family and all sorts of things were happening. I was really sad. He said, in the middle of this important meeting, drafting a major speech, Truman stops the meeting and looks at me and he says, Ken, are you okay? And Ken said, oh, yes, sir. Truman says, no, you're not. He says, something's wrong. Tell me about it. He said, no, Mr. President, nothing wrong, nothing to report. As you were, I'm good, I'm good, I'm good. Because you're not going to worry the president with your, in the middle of the Berlin airlift. And Ken says after the meeting, he goes back to his office. The secretary walks in and hands him a note. Truman invited him to have dinner, just the two of them alone that night together. Dr. Heckler walked in and he was just a speechwriter. It wasn't that he was a Secretary of State or something. He was just a speechwriter. He walked in and Truman said, something's wrong, Ken. He said, Truman went over and sat down at the piano and started playing Bach and Beethoven to make him feel better. And then was telling him jokes, and the two of them had dinner together. And Ken said, this guy is in the middle of running the world after World War II. And he took time out to meet with a junior aide just to try to make him feel better. I'll give you one more. There was a man who, this is one of my favorite letters in the Truman Library. And whenever I go to, I spend my weekends going to libraries, battlefields, and museums. This is what kind of exciting guy I am. Man, I am the most interesting person in the world. I sit in the archives, dusty archives of a museum every other weekend. This is what I do. So and I always call the archivists and tell them, I want you to pull for me your favorite letter, one that made you cry, one that made you laugh, one that's going to make my head spin. And they love to do that because, most professors, with all due respect to my occupation, are pretty, highfalutin and condescending, present company excluded. So somebody to just say to them, pull a fun letter for me. And to my 3 librarian friends, you know what that's like. So they always go extra in for me to find cool stuff. This is one of my favorite ones they found for me. There's a man, this is after Truman's presidency. His car broke down outside of Truman's home, which was on 219 North Delaware Street in Independence, Missouri. So the man goes and knocks on Truman's door and asks to use his phone to call a tow truck. And Truman let him in. And after the man made the call, Truman says to him, listen, it'll probably take a while for the tow truck to come here. Why don't you have a seat? And then Truman got them both an iced tea. The man had no idea who Truman was. Okay. So they sit there and they shoot the breeze for a while. Finally, the man says, well, listen, sir, you've been more than generous with your time. I should go and wait for the tow truck. The man said when he walked out and walked down the steps, walked down the sidewalk, he said, Truman walks out on he didn't know who he was. This man walks out on the step, walks out on the sidewalk with him and is like, bye-bye. The man turns around and looks at him and says, quote unquote, did anyone ever tell you, you look just like that son of a bitch, Harry Truman? And he said, Truman looks at him and smiles and says, yeah, I get that all the time. Have a good day. And then sometime later, the man realized, oh my goodness, that was Truman. So the man wrote this letter to the library, just apologizing page after page. And that was one of the letters that the librarians pulled for me one time. So Harry Truman was born in 1884 in rural Missouri. He's the last president to lack a college degree. He was raised in a family of what we might call unreconstructed Confederates. He was descended on both sides of his family from slave owners. The Trumans were ugly about their racism and about their anti-Semitic views. Truman as a little boy, and there on the left is one of the earliest known pictures of him. Truman as a little boy had bad eyesight, needed glasses, was a great piano player, but was teased mercilessly by other boys. Gangs would get up and beat him almost on a daily basis. While most boys or men would have a chip on their shoulder or shrink away from such confrontation, Harry Truman turned into a rock because of those difficult early experiences and that bullying. He has to work from the time he's a little kid. He's a Shabbos Goy, by the way. So his first introduction into the Jewish community in that region of Kansas City is in that capacity, turn off lights and so forth and so on Sabbath. Truman as a young man has 2 goals. He wants to either join West Point, he wants to go to West Point and be a military officer, or he's thinking either an historian or an architect. And if he wants to be an historian, he's got to be cool. So those are Truman's goals. Well, the problem is he can never go to college. So there goes the latter 2 goals. He's not going to get into West Point because he comes from nothing. So then Truman turns his goals to trying to get into World War I when the war breaks out. There you can see him on the right. He's a member of the Missouri National Guard, Battery D of the artillery. His problem when he goes to get into World War I is Truman can't see. I mean, he's almost blind. So he has to pass the eye test, right? So when he's lining up to do the eye test with the doctor, they have the eye chart on the wall and they say, read the first line, read the third line, whatever. There's 2 other young men. And as the oldest one of the 3, Truman tells the 2 young boys, go before me and I'll wait. So what he does is Truman, much like some of my other heroes, Abe Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton, and Ben Franklin, much like those 3, Truman had a photographic memory. So what happens is Truman listens to those 2 boys read the eye chart, and on the spot, he memorizes the entire eye chart. He walks in, they tell him read line 1, 3, 4, 7, and he just memorized the whole chart by line and did it, and he got into World War I. He wrote that he put an extra pair of glasses in every pocket in his uniform, so if something happened to his glasses. During World War I, a couple of very important things happen. Truman becomes an officer, a captain, so he learns how to lead men. and lead men in combat. And this is a pivotal moment in Truman's life where he matures. He realizes he is a leader. Also, Truman, because he's a captain, he doesn't rise all the way up to being a general. You know, we've had several presidents who had military service. You know, your Washingtons, your Grants, your Teddy Roosevelts, your Eisenhowers, and they approached the issues of war with a very realistic and mature attitude and showed great respect for our soldiers, our POWs, our veterans. Other presidents, as we know, did not respect those, and they lacked military service themselves. Truman had it, and by being a captain, that meant that he actually killed people, and he saw men die. He was in the thick of it. In World War I, for example, Truman was in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. And if anyone knows anything about World War I, that was a bloodbath, and he was knee-deep in it. So he comes back from the war confident and a changed man. So that's young Harry. Let me give you an example of Truman's commitment to statehood for Israel and the betterment of the larger Jewish diaspora, not only in the US, but around the world. And we can date that very early, but in particular, one event was in 1948. It's the Democratic National Convention. Truman is trying to get elected. He's challenged on his political left by Henry Wallace. He's challenged on his political right by Strom Thurmond within his own party, the Dixiecrat, former Klansman, racist. At the time, he was the governor of South Carolina, then be a senator. And oh my God, the people from South Carolina sending back to Washington for decades, a bigoted, anti-Semitic Klansman, sexist too. And then even if Truman managed to hold off the attacks against him within his own party on his left and right, he would lose to Mr. Dewey in 48. So at the convention, there's a moment there that is one of my favorite moments in the 20th century. And what it was is Truman's committee gets up and they announce his platform. And guess what Truman's platform calls him for in 1948? Civil rights, statehood for Israel, women's programs, universal health care for all, government funded. Truman's calling for massive loan guarantees for the fledgling state of Israel. And get this, massive immigration for refugees, including Jews from the displaced persons camps. It's a recipe for losing any election today, yet alone in 1948. Moreover, in 1948, Truman knew that Dewey was going to win New York, Pennsylvania, the North. Truman had to win the Bible Belt, and yet he's calling for civil rights, programs for the Jewish community, women's issues, healthcare. He's going to lose everything. After hearing this platform, Strom Thurmond, who's in the audience, gets up and walks out of the Democratic Convention, taking Southern delegates with him. Basically, the fat lady is backstage warming up. This is the end. Thurmond walks out. Truman's not even going to get his own nomination again. And there's a moment there that the late Coretta Scott King, MLK's widow, used to love to tell this story, and I always tell this story. A group of reporters, stop Thurmond and they say, "Why are you walking out of the convention?" Thurmond says, "Did you hear Truman's platform? Talks about issues for the Jewish community, blacks," and of course, those are not the words he used. And one reporter says to him, "But Governor Thurmond, that's simply what FDR used to always say." And Thurmond says, "Yeah, but here's the difference. We all knew that FDR would only say it. We all know that Truman's actually going to do it." And then he walked out of the convention. That night, Harry Truman in a diary, and Truman was a pack rat. He kept everything, he wrote everything down, which is great for us today because we know more about Harry than virtually any other president because he wrote everything down. And Truman, sort of like Ulysses Grant, another person I liked, like Alexander Hamilton, another one I liked, Truman was incapable of lying, unlike some presidents. Truman was incapable of lying, always told the truth. So when Truman wrote everything down, you could cash a check with that. That night, when he knows he's going to lose, when Thurmond walked out, when it's all over, Truman writes the following line. He's speaking about two issues, statehood for Israel, civil rights. He says, quote unquote, "In doing these, I will lose the White House. So be it. It's the right thing to do," end quote. He would rather do what's right and lose than do what's wrong and win. I don't know about you all, but that almost sounds quaint by today's standards, doesn't it? And I think you'd all agree with me that that's probably the last time any politician ever said that. So boy, you talk about Truman's commitment to Israel. I think you can really see it coming out of the 48 convention. What's more, Truman was opposed by his own Joint Chiefs on Israel. He was opposed by his own State Department. He was opposed by his wife. He was opposed by his senior advisors, both political parties, the British, and he was opposed by this guy. This is General George Marshall, the former great chief of staff of the military, one of the men that helped us win World War II. General Marshall was truly one of the great Americans of the 20th century, maybe the closest thing to the embodiment or reincarnation of George Washington. Harry Truman used to call Marshall the Great One. Truman used to always say that Marshall was the greatest living American. And of course, Marshall of the Marshall Plan. What an act of humility and magnanimity by Harry Truman. Truman was the architect of the Marshall Plan. Imagine an uneducated, failed farmer from rural Missouri who was poorly traveled, who designs the Marshall Plan after World War II. This is the plan that's going to rebuild Europe, save Western civilization, stop the spread of communism. I mean, unbelievable. But Truman knows this. He, Harry Truman, is so unpopular at home that he would never get this through Congress. He would never build public support for it. Truman is a small, failed farmer and rural haberdasher. On the international stage, he utterly and completely lacks the kind of gravitas and stature needed to get Europe to listen to this. So what Truman does, and I can't think of another president except perhaps Grant, who would have done this. Truman names it after Marshall, not himself. I mean, Bill Clinton would have named it the Clinton Plan, and thank you very much, right? Trump would have named it, I'm Donald Trump, the greatest person who's ever lived plan. W would have named it the W Plan. Everybody would have. Truman names it after Marshall, not only because he's humble, but he knows if Marshall goes to Congress and asks for money, they're going to say yes. Imagine being a junior member of Congress from a small state. The door knocks, an entourage of military officers with bling walks in, followed by this guy, barrel-chested, baritone-voiced, silver-haired, straight out of Central Casting, George Marshall. And Marshall probably walked in and said, son, I'm going to need you to do something for your country. What would the answer be, Rhonda? Sir, yes, sir, right? So ditto, Marshall went to Europe and met with European leaders. Only Marshall had the stature to get them on board. So here's the problem for Truman. While the Marshall Plan's being rolled out, while Truman's running for re-election, while Truman is fighting for statehood for Israel, Marshall tells Truman that he opposes statehood for Israel. That if Truman pushes statehood for Israel, Marshall will, 1, publicly resign, 2, publicly vote against him. Could you imagine the impact of that? And just how personally devastating it was for Truman. Now, I'm happy to tell you, lest you think Marshall was an anti-Semite, he wasn't. The reason why Marshall was opposed to statehood for Israel, Marshall said, here's what's going to happen. The Russians are arming the Arabs. They're going to arm the Arabs, go joint hit the hip with them. They're going to drive the Jews into the sea. We're not going to get a drop of oil. We're going to have to defend the new fledgling state, and we're going to have World War III. And you know what? That was a very real scenario. A lot of military strategists, Truman's Pentagon told him that's what, if Marshall says that's what's going to happen, there was a good chance of it happening. Happily, I'm here to tell you that Truman told Marshall, I refuse to accept your resignation. You can vote against me, but you're going to work for me and you're going to support statehood for Israel, and we're going to make this thing happen. And it did. Proof is in the pudding. Here's the letter, the former declaration or decree. The State Department didn't want to draw up the proclamation. So they used this bureaucratic language that the United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the Jewish state. You know, how uninspiring is that? Look what Harry Truman did. He crosses out the Jewish state and writes the State of Israel. And approved with big, bold letters and a large confidence signature over it. There was still some talk and debate in 48 as to what Israel would be called. There was a lot of disagreement. Weizmann had one idea, Eben had one idea. Ben Gurion's the one who liked Israel, and since he was the leader, that's what became. But Truman wasn't even sure what it would be called. But when he met with Ben Gurion, Weizmann, and Eben, Truman liked that it would have that name, so he crosses it out and writes it. There on the right, you see this pandemonium in Jewish communities in New York and Philadelphia and Chicago, all across Israel, people celebrating. It's official. Truman is the first leader in the world to recognize Israel, but Truman does more than recognize Israel. He floats Israel. Get this, after World War II, when the United States is broke and Americans are isolationists, as we oftentimes are, regrettably, Truman floats Israel a $100 million loan guarantee. $100 million. How the heck he got that approved through Congress, I'll never know, but what a Herculean act of political leadership. Truman also promises that he'll veto any anti-Israel measures in the United Nations, which he did. Truman inks some agreements with Israel, joint military cooperation, intelligence sharing. The US will protect Israeli patents, copyrights, and trademarks in the world community, immigration exchanges, cultural exchanges. I mean, these are the things, the very ingredients that cement the bonds of friendship between the Israeli people and the American people. And it all starts with Harry Truman. So what an act. So on the right there, that picture reminds me of a story. Have you all heard of Dr. Chaim Weizmann? Anybody? Weizmann was the Zionist leader, one of the architects of statehood, a chemist, a scientist, and a world-renowned intellectual. So Weizmann and Truman become fast friends over this. And there's a wonderful letter that Weizmann wrote Truman. It's now in the Truman Presidential Library. I held it in my hands with gloves on, like you have to do when you go into these places. So, and Weizmann is telling Truman that when statehood was announced, Weizmann's aides come running into his office. Weizmann's sitting in his office writing letters. And the aides say, Dr. Weizmann, haven't you heard? He said, yeah, I heard. They said, no, it's official. Statehood, Truman recognized us. Why aren't you celebrating? And Weizmann says two things, and he says this in his letter to Truman. Number one, he told him, now the real work begins. He says, I'm writing letters to every world leader. We got to get the world to recognize us and agree to work with us, which of course, as you know, in 48 and 49, 6 neighboring countries immediately declared war on the state of Israel, and many countries around the world boycotted Israel. When they boycotted Israel, Truman gave Israel the predecessor of today, what is known as MFN, Most Favored Nation, trading status. So while the world was boycotting Israel, wouldn't sell anything to them, wouldn't buy anything from them, Truman is selling to and buying from Israel like hotcakes, which helps Israel's fledgling economy on a request from Weizmann. So Weizmann says two things to the aide. Number one, he goes, yeah, I knew it was going to happen. He goes, but now the real work begins. Like, we got to get the world to like us. Number two, he said, I always knew it would happen. The aide said, how would you know it would happen? This is what he said. Because when I met with Truman, he gave me his word and shook my hand. Could you imagine, given the current political climate in the last couple of years, could you imagine a situation where a handshake, my word, is good enough for Marilyn and Rhonda and Hannah to go and cash it at the bank? Well, I mean, my word is, but you get the point. Someone's word is good. And imagine the future of the Jewish people after the Holocaust. And Weizmann settles for Truman's word in a handshake. That's what kind of man Harry Truman was. So that image on the right always reminded me of that story. One of the first things Truman gets busy on after World War II is the DPs. DP stands for displaced person. As you all know, all of Europe was in ruin after the war, and the economy in every country had just completely tanked. There weren't enough vaccinations, medicine, clothing, blankets, coal, fuel, food. The fields laid fallow during the duration of the war. Sewage systems, electrical and water plants had been blown up. Open sewage, raw sewage is festering in cities from cities being bombed. Carcasses of cattle, pigs, and humans are strewn across the landscape. Europe is looking down the barrel of a continental-wide pandemic and the loss of potentially millions of Europeans. Most pressingly, the DPs. You have displaced homeless people across the continent. Now, vis-a-vis the Jewish community, here's the problem. Many Jews living in a DP camp didn't want to go back home. And who could blame them? If I'm from Poland and just survived pogrom after pogrom in Poland and the Holocaust, I wouldn't go back. Would you? If I'm from Germany or Austria or the Czech Republic or Russia, I wouldn't go back. And folks wouldn't go back, so they were stuck in DP camps. Unfortunately, many of the DP, because there were so many DPs, millions, and so few camps, that the Allies, we, the United States, decided to use, get this, former concentration camps as DP camps. People who survived the Holocaust were living in their striped uniforms in a former concentration camp, now called a DP camp. Jews were being attacked and beaten on a regular basis by other locals. Why? Everybody was fighting for food, survival of the fittest, Lord of the Flies. But if you're Jewish, you just survived the Holocaust, which means you're skin and bones. There's no way you can defend yourself. These are the conditions. The Allies, under the leader that I'll talk about in a moment, made the following decision. Jews that had survived the Holocaust were potential enemy combatants. Therefore, they could not send or receive mail. Could you imagine surviving the Holocaust and not being able to write to find your loved ones, or if your house is still there? You couldn't receive or send mail. It was Harry Truman that transformed the condition of DPs. Number one, he sent over food, medicine, clothing. He sent over rabbis and told the rabbis, deliver mail, collect mail, and on my orders, it will be distributed. Truman transformed the DP camps. I'm going to skip forward to this guy. Truman also had the courage to fire this guy. You all recognize this person. That's General Patton, one of the great heroes of the war and an iconic figure by the end of the war. Patton was put nominally in charge of the DP camps. Now, Patton would die shortly thereafter in an untimely car wreck. But Patton was nominally put in charge of the displaced persons, the DP camps. And Patton was an anti-Semite, a bitter anti-Semite. It was Patton who made the decision that Jews in the DP camps after the Holocaust could not send or receive mail. He did not guarantee that they were given blankets or clothing or medicine or adequate food, nor did he protect them from the attacks from non-Jews. Here's a quote from Patton that really reveals the extent of this. Others believe that the displaced person is a human being, which he is not. And this applies particularly to the Jews who are lower than animals. That's a direct quote from Patton. What does Truman do? Fires Patton. That takes courage, given Patton's standing. Fires Patton. Then it comes to this guy here. Oh, hang on. There we go. Earl Harrison. I encourage you all to look up, if you're interested in the story of the creation of the state of Israel, look up the Harrison report. Earl Harrison, as you can see from the image here, is straight from Central Casting. Looks like a Hollywood extra. He's the dean of the law school at Penn. And Harrison is a charismatic, intellectual, well-respected figure. What Truman does is Truman hears these reports of these horrific conditions in these displaced persons camps and Jews being beaten, denied food, they can't send mail. So Truman dispatches Harrison to go to the camps and produce the Harrison report. It's Harrison that comes back with the alarming news of the conditions of the camp that leads to Truman firing Patton and Truman, transforming the camps. Truman wisely, like I told you a moment earlier about George Marshall, Truman realizes that he, Harry Truman, lacks the stature or gravitas to get Congress to fund millions and millions of dollars of relief for the Jewish community in the DP camps after the war. So he sends Earl Harrison to walk the halls of Congress. Harrison has the stature to get members of Congress to listen to him, and he's filled with stories of just death and despair from the Holocaust. He gets the funding. Here's a line from Harrison in respect to what General Patton was doing with the displaced persons camp. As things stand now, we appear to be treating the Jews as the Nazis treated them, except that we do not exterminate them. They are in concentration camps in large numbers under our military guard instead of the SS troops. One is led to wonder whether the German people, seeing this, are not surprised that we are following or at least condoning Nazi policy. Wow. So it's Truman that sends Harrison with the funding, transforms the camps, fires Patton, and then Truman begins the process, get this, of bringing almost 400,000 Jews from the DP camps into the United States. You know the American position today on bringing immigrants into this country. Ironically and hypocritically, even though we're a land of immigrants, you know, I don't even need to go there. You know where we are. Cages on the Mexican border, January 6th insurrections, the Proud Boys, the QAnon. Truman is the one who brings almost 400,000, and it was enormously unpopular. Truman has a fight, as you can see here, with Clement Attlee, the British leader. The British want no Jews going to Palestine. Truman puts a committee together and stacks the committee with loyalists to himself and rabbis. They recommend 100,000 Jews be admitted to Palestine. Truman knows that one of the essential ingredients for Israel to work is you need a critical number of Jews on the ground. If Jews can't get there, you're never going to have a state. So Truman wants a critical mass going there. Attlee finally counters, and the British tell Truman, get this, we'll let 1,500 Jews go to Palestine. Truman says, how about 1,500 per month? They say no. He said, okay, I've given you a chance. We're admitting 100,000. The British say no. Truman says, he who pays, plays. Truman floated the British a multi-billion-dollar loan guarantee. You will listen to me. And then Truman opened up. As you probably are aware, a number of Jews fleeing the displaced persons camps by barely seaworthy craft, trying to make it to Palestine and Transjordan. The British policy was this: British warships would ram and tow these ships back to displaced persons camps if necessary. We don't know how many Jews were lost at sea in these barely seaworthy craft. I'm reminded of Cubans coming to Florida, Jews fleeing on anything that floated to try to get to from these camps in Cyprus and elsewhere to Palestine, Transjordan. When Truman discovered this, it was Truman who forced the Royal Navy to cease and desist from this policy and allow Jews to sail to Palestine. In fact, then Truman said the Royal Navy will escort them there. So this is the depth of Truman's commitment. One of my favorite stories, you'll like this one. This involves Abba Hillel Silver on the left and Stephen Wise on the right. I'm guessing everybody's heard of these two, right? These two guys are arguably the most influential and famous rabbis of the 1940s. So on the eve of statehood for Israel, which occurs on May 14th, 1948 at 6:11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, by the way, if you're keeping track. So on the eve of statehood for Israel, Truman invites the leading rabbis in the country to come to his office. And here's the purpose of the meeting. Truman says to them, I don't want you to read about statehood for your homeland in a newspaper. I want you to hear it from my mouth. I want you to know first, and I want you to go out to your flock, your congregation, and tell them what's going to happen. This is a really thoughtful gesture, right, everybody? In the middle of all these other things Truman's doing after the war, he thinks to bring the rabbis in. Well, Hillel Silver, Abba Hillel Silver, is a brilliant man. He's a world-class intellectual. He's charismatic. He's a spellbinding speaker, but he's also a megalomaniac. He's a narcissist. And Silver goes into the meeting with Truman. And get this, everybody. In the middle of the meeting, when Truman announces he has General Marshall on a short leash, he's muzzled the British, He has the $100 million loan guarantee I told you about. Statehood's going to happen. And I'm proud to tell you first, Silver says this to Truman. He accuses him of lying to him. Then Silver calls Truman an anti-Semite to his face. Truman says, what part of this did you not hear? I've got it done. It's just a matter of just signing the proclamation. I just wanted you to know. Silver gets into a fight with Truman. This is what a megalomaniac and narcissist Silver is. Silver says to Truman, Truman should have come to him with the news rather than him being summoned to Truman. Then Silver pounds his fists on Truman's desk. Everybody, the HMS Resolute, the famous presidential desk. Truman explodes out of his seat and says, quote unquote, all the quotes are verbatim that I've been giving you. Rhonda knows this, I always memorize quotes for my audiences. Truman explodes out of his seat and says, quote unquote, no one, and I mean no one, pounds his fists on the desk of the president of the United States. You can get the hell out of my office. He throws Silver out of his office. The two get into a huge fight. The Silver goes out of the office and the media's out there. They put a microphone in Silver's face and guess what he does? He endorses Dewey, Truman's opponent in 1948. Silver almost derails statehood on the eve of statehood. Then he goes around on a lecture tour to synagogues, congregations all across the country, telling everybody, Truman's an anti-Semite. He threw me out of his office. Silver is undermining on the eve of this incredible issue. Now, twice I've had the great honor, Silver was from Cleveland. I've had the honor of going to Cleveland and lecturing from Silver's bema, from his pulpit at his temple. And the first time I went, I told this story. And I told the audience that if a lightning bolt comes down from heaven and blows me off the bema and the podium, you know, Silver's not going to be happy with telling his congregation the story, but we must speak truth to power. The hero of the story is the man on the right there. That's Stephen Wise, a rabbi from New York. And I also had the great honor of being asked to go to Rabbi Wise's synagogue in New York City and telling the Wise version of the story. Wise, so as Silver tells everybody that Truman's an anti-Semite, the Zionist community, Ben Gurion, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, they're all in a panic that Truman is an anti-Semite. That's what Silver says. Wise says, no, I was in the meeting. It was Silver who overreacted. I believe Truman. Truman's with us. Truman's one of us. Then Wise remembered that Harry Truman's best friend was a Jew, Eddie Jacobson, his World War I partner and his haberdashery business partner. Eddie and Harry were best friends. Harry was 7 years Eddie's senior, more like the big brother in the relationship. And like many men that were in war, Harry and Eddie planned that if we live through the war, we'll open up our haberdashery in Missouri. And they did, and it went bankrupt. And Harry paid off Eddie's debts for him. So they were very close. So Wise said, we got to find Eddie Jacobson. And Eddie has to intervene on behalf of the Zionist community and prevent the damage that Silver's doing. So Wise is the hero of the story. There's Eddie and Harry in their store, in their haberdashery store. So Wise gets Eddie to go meet with Harry and ask Harry, would you please meet with the great Dr. Weizmann, the scientist, the chemist, the Zionist leader who's really planning, is the architect of statehood for Israel in the 40s, because they're worried that Weizmann will think Truman's an anti-Semite. So Eddie agrees to go meet with Harry. Now you can see from the photograph here that Eddie is, shall we say, follically challenged, okay? So that's necessary for the story. Eddie goes to meet with Harry and says to Harry, you've got to meet, he gets 4 sentences out. You got to meet with Dr. Weizmann. He's an old man. He's in New York City. He's devoted his life to statehood. And then Eddie starts crying and crying and crying. Please, Harry. Harry takes Eddie around his head and gives him a big hug, a bear hug, one of those disappear in your chest hugs. And Eddie says to him, quote unquote, all right, you old bald-headed SOB, for you, I'll meet with him. But it's not a, Michael Beschloss, one of the nation's former leading historians, I had a beef with him several years ago. he and another historian were doing a program, and they said Truman doesn't deserve all this credit for Israel. He called a Jew an SOB. And I told him, I said, are you nuts? It was Truman's best friend. It was like nookies for your best buddy. Oh, you SOB. It was two best buddies hugging one another. So Truman agrees to meet with Dr. Weizmann, who's going to save the day. And here's the picture. And I love this, one of my favorite pictures. There's Weizmann and Truman. Now, when Weizmann walks, the ground trembles, right, everybody? Weizmann is not known for smiling. Eve of statehood for Israel, he's this serious person. Truman makes Weizmann laugh so hard he almost pees his pants. So Chaim Weizmann comes in to meet with Truman. Now, it's an icy cold meeting. Why? Truman really doesn't want to meet with Weizmann. Truman tells his staff, he's going to come in here like Silver and call me an anti-Semite and endorse Dewey. And Truman says, I'm getting it from everyone. Truman wrote this about a 14-page rant in the back of a real estate book, just venting one day when he couldn't take it anymore. He said, the Greeks and Turks are against me, the State Department's against me, the British are against me, the Republicans want me out of office, my own party's against me. And then he ends up by saying, and now the very people I'm trying to help, the Jewish community, now they're criticizing me. I can't get a break. So Truman doesn't want to meet with Weizmann. He's worried that he's going to come in and dismiss him. So Weizmann goes in to meet with Truman. And what Truman told his aides is, I don't want the press to know Weizmann's here, because if he endorses Dewey, that's the nail in the coffin. So Truman sneaks Weizmann into the meeting. Weizmann thinks he's being brought in through the back door because he's a Jew. So Weizmann and his entourage are not happy. Truman's not happy. So they start the ceremony. They unveil the beribboned documents, and the great, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, Zionist leader, hereby introduces himself to the American president. The protocols of diplomatic introductions back then. Weizmann sees that Truman is not paying attention whatsoever. So Weizmann stops the meeting and says, here, none of that. And he gives Truman the Torah that he's holding right there, the scroll, presents Truman with the Torah. Truman says this to Weizmann, quote unquote, he says, thanks for the thing. I've always really wanted one of these. And then he winks at him. Weizmann starts laughing. He realizes Truman has a sense of humor. He's a good guy. Now, Truman in his Missouri drawl cannot pronounce C-H-A-I-M. Chaim. In his Missouri drawl, Truman calls him Cham. And Weizmann starts busting. Weizmann goes, Chaim. Truman goes, Cham. And that's when a photographer snapped the picture you're looking at. And I did a book on this, and this is the picture I asked my publisher to put on the front cover, because Truman made Weizmann laugh. Then Truman says to Weizmann, he goes, look, Cham, why don't we just cut the crap? You and I go in the back room and talk. And they did. Now, neither one wrote down what happened in that room. Oh, to have been a fly on the wall. But here's what we know. When they came out of the room, they were arm in arm. When they came out of the room, it was Weizmann that went to Silver and said, come here, zip it. Truman's with us, he's one of us. It was Weizmann that undid the damage. And that's why, as I said earlier, it was Weizmann that wrote Truman the letter saying that when they busted into his office saying, Dr. Weizmann, haven't you heard, Statehood's official? He said, yeah, I knew it was going to happen because Truman gave me his word and shook my hand. That was the relationship the two of them had. So that was an important relationship for this together. Two other ones that were cute. And I've read all these letters in the Truman Library. It's wonderful. And if you're nerded out like me, and I know you are because you're all friends of the Stirling Road Library, and now I'm officially a friend because I've given so many talks. I'm the BFF of the Stirling Road Library, right? So at any rate, Weizmann writes Truman a letter with Ben-Gurion, the leader of Israel. And Weizmann says in the letter, I don't know if you know this or not, but I'm a much more important world leader than you are. And Weizmann says, even though you're the leader of 150 million people and I'm the leader of only 500,000 people, he says, I'm the leader of 500,000 people who all think they're the leader, in reference to Silver and rabbis giving Truman grief. So Truman brings out a sense of humor in Weizmann, who's like carved into Mount Rushmore. And in my favorite letter from Weizmann, I asked when I was, as I said at the outset, I interviewed for a multiple year period, all these advisors to Harry Truman, everyone that was still alive from 20 to 25 years ago. And I also interviewed a number of Israeli diplomats to get the behind the scenes story on this. I asked several of Truman's advisors in this multiple year series of interviews I conducted, did Harry ever make you laugh? Did Harry ever make you cry? Did he ever make you mad? Because I wanted my interviews that were put in the Truman Library to not be boring about interest rates or inflation. I wanted people in 50 or 1,000 years to really understand the Truman that I've always liked. So when I asked the aides, did Harry ever make you laugh? They said, oh yeah, he had a favorite joke he used to tell over and over and over. And this was his joke. Truman would always say, politicians are the worst people in the world. He said, so remembering that, he would say, don't tell my mother I'm in politics. She thinks I play the piano in a whorehouse. So he would say a brothel pianist is preferable to being the president. When I asked, did Truman ever make you mad? One of the aides told me, yeah, he made me furious. Truman had made a mistake once. And he announced to his team, his advisors, he said, I got to go tell the public that I made a mistake. And they said, no, you don't. No one knows. Either don't say anything or blame it on someone. Truman said, no, I made a mistake. I have to tell the people. And they said, Mr. President, nobody knows what just happened. And the aide said, we were so angry with him. He walks into a press conference and says, I have something to say. I made a mistake. I blew this and that and the other. That's how honest he was, as I told you at the outset of the speech, much like Grant, Hamilton, and others. So when I asked the aides, there were two of his speechwriters, Ken Heckler and George Elsey, if he ever made you cry. They looked at one another, they went back and forth, and they said, yes. They said, did you ever see him cry? Was what I asked. And did you ever cry? And they said, yes. Truman got a letter from Weizmann. And in recognition of what Truman did, this is what Weizmann said in his letter, quote unquote, to Truman thanking him. He said, generations of Jewish children yet unborn will call you father. And they said, Truman cried like a baby, and they all did too. So that shows you the depth of his commitment. So Truman met with him. Now here's David Ben-Gurion seated beside Truman, the leader of Israel, and Abba Eban. I've never been a big Ben-Gurion fan, I must admit, but I've always loved Abba Eban. Eban was a world-class intellectual. He was all of 33 years old at the time this picture was taken, when Israel was created in 1948. And talk about a job. Weizmann sends Eban around the world to make the world like Israel and work with them. He's 33. But Weizmann tells Eban, there's one leader that you need to prioritize. Of course, you know who that is, Truman. And Weizmann told Eban, he said, but now I want you to remember something when you meet with Truman. You're not meeting with Truman. You're meeting with Moses. That's what he said. Because he brought us to the promised land. You're meeting with Moses, he told Eban. So Eban is so excited to meet with Truman. And he's also so nervous to meet with Truman. And he hears a story from one of the other junior Israeli diplomats. And here's the story, and it's a true story. It's in the Truman Library. Right before statehood, the US State Department and the British Diplomatic Service, as you know, as I said earlier, were opposed to statehood for Israel. They were trying to undermine it. So what they did was they set up a meeting. You have the British and American diplomats in a meeting. They set up a meeting with Truman. Now, remember this is important for the story. Truman was not prepped. He was not briefed. He had no notes. He wasn't warned that this was a meeting. He thought he was just walking in to press the flesh, shake some hands. How are you, boys? As he would always say, and that would be it. Truman walks into the meeting. There's the British and American diplomats. They ambush him. And here's the tone of their comments. You need to remember that you are one of us, not one of them, talking about Jews. They have their priorities. We have ours. You need, so this condescending, borderline anti-Semitic, and they're trying to talk Truman out of it. Truman is aghast. After they finish, this is what he says, quote unquote, he goes, all right, sit down, boys. He always used boys. You've had your chance. Now it's mine. And he proceeded to tick off a multiple 1,000-year history off the top of his head of the Jewish people. Remember, he's not prepped, briefed. He ticks off names, dates, and events, Jacob, Isaac, Noah, Moses, Abraham, and just off the top of his head. He gives them a lecture on Judaic history that would be worthy of a PhD in Israel. Then when he finishes, he tells them, when I am matured in my course of action, I am immovable. And now you can all get the hell out of my office. He threw them all out of his office. Then Truman writes a one-sentence memo to be distributed to all of his aides. I've held it in my hands. Now, Rhonda, can I quote verbatim? It's a little saucy, this letter. So please bear with me, but it's real history, everybody, and we're adults. And to my niece, Willow, who's on the call, close your ears, Willow. Come back on in about 30 seconds, okay? So this is what Truman, this is what he writes in his letter. This shows you how angry he was. Quote, unquote, never trust the goddamn sons of bitches in the State Department. Harry S. Truman. He was so mad at him because they ambushed him, they lambasted him there. So Abba Eben goes to meet with Truman. He hears this story. He says, oh my gosh, this guy knows more about us than we do. He goes to meet with Truman. Now, Eben is a wordsmith, you know, Shakespearean. He's got that accent, everybody. You've probably heard him speak. You know, he's got the demeanor, you know, he should have been on Downton Abbey. A butler. At any rate, so Carson. So he goes to meet with Truman. He needs the right thing to say to Truman. He can't just say, thank you, Mr. President, I'm going to work with you. This is what he says. He says, my nation is a brand new poor nation, the size of New Jersey. We don't have B-ribbon documents. We don't have treasures. We cannot knight you. We cannot bestow riches upon you. But here's what we can do. My people have, their names will be, you know, forever carved into the annals of history. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Noah, he ticks it off. The world will never forget them. And, Mr. President, he says, to that list, we will add the name Truman. Mr. President, to thank you, we, the Israeli people, give you immortality. Can I get a microphone to drop? Right, everybody? I mean, is that amazing or is that amazing? And then he finishes, he learns, he does his homework, he even finds out that Truman is a fan of Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, 4th, 5th century BCE, the first to bring Jews back to Jerusalem, not Darius, not Xerxes, who was a psychopath, Cyrus. So he finds out that Truman is a fan of Cyrus the Great. So he closes it by saying, for you are the American Cyrus. Wow. Truman looks at him and pats him on the shoulder and says, no, just Harry. And the two of them form that fast friendship. So let me bring this to a close. What explains Truman's change of heart? This is the last president to lack a college degree. Grew up in a household of descended from slave owners, anti-Semitic. A few things. Number one, Truman had a number of Jewish friends. Remember, I told you he was a Shabbos Goy. Truman had a lot of Jewish friends. His best friend was a Jew. There he is on the left with Eddie. A number of synagogues, Hillels, and other things were named in honor of Eddie for what he did to help make the state of Israel possible. So here's a picture of whenever Eddie would go to the naming of something for him, he would call Harry and say, come along with me. The ex-president took the time out to go to the opening of a little Hillel, if it was named for Eddie Jacobson. And Eddie wrote that at one time when they were look at them running like kids, they were goofy. They were like kids together. Eddie wrote that once when they named a Hillel after him, he looked over at Harry and he said Truman was crying like a baby, just to give you the sense. A second thing that factored into Truman's change of heart was Truman was not religious. Truman always said he would never trust anybody that was too religious, in particular, Southern Baptists. But that's a motto I've always adopted. But Truman loved the Old Testament. He was, as I said a moment ago, photographic. He loved the sweeping tales. He loved Samson and Daniel, and he loved all the Lion's Den. He loved these sweeping epics from the Old Testament. So what he told Eben was, he said, I know the thousands of years of persecution, but I also know about the promise. So he wanted to make that promise a reality. Thirdly, you're looking at a picture of Captain Harry from World War I, because Truman killed people and saw people die in the war. I always, when I lecture on Truman at the Truman Library and for Truman Scholars, I always say there's two Harrys. There's Harry before the war and Harry after World War I. Before the war, it's the failed, farmer and uneducated, untraveled kid from a bigoted family in rural Missouri. After the war, it's a different Harry. Truman comes back from the war and he says, I've seen the evil that men can do to one another. I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to being a champion for the people who need a champion. Now, in the post-World War II era, who needed a champion more than the Jewish community? So that factors in. So those are the three reasons why I think we can understand Truman's change of heart. I'd like to add a fourth one. I can't point to a document or a writing or a speech, but having spent my adult life with Harry to the point where he and I are on a first name basis, I'm going to add this. Truman was simply one of those people. Have you all met people like this? I have a best friend who's like this. That is just someone who has a moral compass, a good person. My buddy out there, Karen, my niece, Willow, these are just good people, right? Truman was one of those people. When FDR had to make a decision, FDR approached it like a chess player. He would give up a pawn, move a knight, maybe, right? When Truman had to make a decision, he'd reach down inside himself and grab his moral compass and not let go. To Truman, the issue that complicated, multifaceted Rubik's Cube of statehood for Israel was quite simple. As he wrote, he said it simply, is it the right thing to do? The answer is yes, I'm doing it. So that's why Truman had a change of heart. I have a lot of blah, blah, blah here. I'm going to move to the end and simply say I'm way over time. So when Truman was leaving the White House on January 20th, 1953, his approval was at the 22-23% range. The very first presidential approval poll was taken by Mr. Gallup, George Gallup, in the year 1933. From 1933 until today, the president with the all-time lowest approval was not Nixon on the eve of Watergate, not W after he let people die in New Orleans after the hurricane, not Trump after his 11,000th lie and putting children in cages. The president with the lowest approval rating, not Carter after he fumbled the rescue mission. It was what? Truman. It was Truman. An Ivy League historian, so much for the Ivies, wrote that Truman was one of the worst presidents of history and the single worst president of the 20th century when he left office. I want you to remember the 20th century had Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. So Truman's leaving office. There were no crowds, no fanfare. Eisenhower, when Truman invited Ike into the White House, the outgoing president invites the incoming president in for scones, tea, and a tour. Ike stiffed Harry and sat out in the car and refused to get out of the car to see Harry. There was no fanfare, no goodbyes. Truman's carrying his own suitcase. One of his senior aides, the most senior aide that was still alive, told me that they were trying to cheer Harry up. He said, Mr. President, the Marshall Plan saved Europe. You saved Western civilization. Mr. President, the Berlin airlift prevented World War III. Mr. President, all the things Truman did, foreign aid, public housing for the poor. Truman pushed the first civil rights measures. And then they got to this and they said, Mr. President, the aide told me, he said, we told him, thousands of Jews are alive today because you got them out of the DP camps and brought them into the US. And he said, Truman all of a sudden stopped his moping and looked at the aides and said, how many did we get? The aide said, almost 400,000. And he said, Truman shook his head and said, it's not enough. He said, I could have done more. And the aide said, no, you couldn't, because here was the problem. We had immigration quotas, 1,000 from Brazil, 10,000 from Greece, whatever. Now, if you're Jewish and you're a DP, you're stateless because you're not back in Germany or Poland, so you can't come in under Germany's quotas or Poland's. If you're in a DP camp, you don't come in from anywhere. So Truman knew there were hundreds of thousands of DPs who would die in these camps, who were stateless. So here's what he told the aides to do. And the most senior aide told me, he said, Truman should have been impeached for doing this. What Truman did was he fabricated the entire immigration quota system. He took it out of the hands of the State Department, put it in the executive office of the president. This is what he told the aides. Find me Jews in the camps and find me countries that haven't filled their immigration quota. So if Greece still had 500 slots, Truman would look at his aides and wink and say, I heard there's 5,000 Greeks in Cyprus. And they would list Jews as fake countries to get them into the country. So that's Truman's commitment. He was depressed. He thought he could have done more, and yet he couldn't have done more. And in closing, as I said at the outset, it's easy to be cynical about our politics today, given some of the political leaders we've had. But here's a case where one man made a difference, where someone outgrew his upbringing and did the right thing. And to Harry Truman, all these great momentous decisions were simply, is it the right thing to do? So when you think we can't possibly find someone at the most inopportune of times and the most opportune of times, along comes a great leader. Never stop reaching out to people and telling people what needs to be done for the cause of social justice, because who knows when along comes a Harry Truman and does the right thing. And after all that, guess what? Where I began, he beat Dewey in 48-1. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Watson. That was fascinating and so enjoyable to learn about Truman and the history around that time. There are a few questions in the chat, but since we've kind of gone over, I just want to say there was a compliment, I think it's from one of your students, that
Probably
said,
one of my relatives that I paid to tell them I'll send them the $20 after the Zoom.
oh, one of the I think it's a student who said, Dr. Watson makes sure his students want to learn and he imparts information of interest. He makes lectures so fascinating.
That's nice. Find out who that student is so I can give him an A.
I'll give the first name, Ruthie.
Okay. So who has questions? Why don't you read me the questions, Rhonda? And I'll
Well, I think we only have time for one question, maybe. And I think you've answered some of this.
Ruthie says she's not the student, but she'll take the A. You got the A, Ruthie. Hi, Ruthie.
Oh, okay.
And I'm Miss Saperstein. So.
Okay. You sort of talked about this, but the question is, when Truman left office, he had a very low approval rating. How much of this is because of his support of Israel and the Jewish people? If you just want to talk a little bit for a minute or so.
So if you think about the Marshall Plan, floating then $15 billion to rebuild Germany and Europe. Today, we realize that saved Europe. Back then, it was very unpopular. You're going to forgive Germany? Truman said, forgive, not forget. There's a difference. And it saved Western civilization. And if we didn't rebuild them, Truman said, we'll be fighting them in another 20 years. Think of World War I and World War II, how we botched. Think of how we botched through deindustrialization, demilitarization, and reparations, how we botched after World War I the treatment of Germany. Think of the Berlin airlift. Most Americans were furious at the Soviets. They wanted to gas the tanks up and go in there. Truman said, no, we're going to find a way of flying relief in. In the middle of the Berlin airlift, when we are flying coal and fuel and food and flour to keep an entire great city alive, when the Soviets blockaded it, no access by road, rail, or water. So Truman says, we'll fly them in. In the middle of the Berlin airlift, which is probably as close as we've ever come to World War III, Truman's worried about the little kids in Berlin. We're dropping off food and flour and sugar and toilet paper and coal. What is there for the kids? So Truman authorizes what's called, has anybody heard of the candy bomber? Karen, I'm sure you've heard me talk about this, or some of you. His name was Gail Horvison. Gail Horvison was the candy bomber. Hershey Foods donates tons of chocolate, so buy Hershey, plus they're socially responsible. And they bombed the children of Berlin with chocolate bars. The public was not happy about this. We're in the middle of World War III, and Truman's worried, are the kids going to get chocolate and candy? So statehood for Israel today, we realized, was bold. And I might add, Truman wanted a two-state solution, which I do. So he was fair on both sides. None of this was popular. So this, Rhonda, is why Truman was so unpopular. I was very good friends with the longtime director of the Truman Presidential Library, Dr. Devine. And I asked him, what are the most common letters that you get at the Presidential Library? Remember, Truman dropped the atomic bomb. Truman saved the world. Truman presided over the UN, NATO. I mean, momentous decisions. The two most common things they get, number two, is people are angry over statehood for Israel. So the anti-Semitic blowback clearly, yes, Rhonda, clearly factored into it, no question. Imagine getting more hate over helping save Holocaust survivors than an issue like dropping the bomb. And guess what? The single most number one letter that they get at the Truman Library. People want to go in the basement and see where Truman hid the aliens from Roswell. It's the United States we're talking about, after all. So it's got to be something utterly stupid and insane. And Dr. Devine told me that he turns down every request. Well, he's no longer the director. He's the director for 20 years. He always turns down every, and the new library director told me he does too. They turn down every request because you can't have crazies with red hats running around the basement of the library looking for cues and aliens, right? But because you have scholars and kids groups, every time they turn down a request, what does that do though? Yeah, it feeds the beast. People say, Truman hid the aliens in the basement of the president's. I'm here for the record, everybody. I've been in the basement of the Truman Library. There's no aliens. His cars are there, his top hat, and his cane, and his wallet is there. So at any rate, yeah, all that factors into Truman. Here's another thing that factors into Truman's unpopularity. He followed FDR. That's like going on stage at a concert after the Beatles have played, right? And he's before Eisenhower, you know, the supreme Allied commander of World War II. And Truman is not charismatic. He's not a good speaker. He's not tall. He's not. It's Harry. So he's in between those bookends. Nobody comes out well. But I'll leave you with this. Truman was asked by a reporter about how unpopular he was and that nobody liked Harry, and good riddance when he left office. And this is what Truman said, and I love this. He said, "Oh, I don't worry about it. I don't worry about it at all." He said, "I have great faith in the American people." He said, "You give them 20 years. He said, they'll see the wisdom in all I've done." Guess what, everybody? Truman was considered we have those presidential ranking polls. They started in 1948 with Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the great Harvard, and they get about 3-4 dozen of the leading historians in the country and me. So that I'm the typo. And we, every 2 or 3 years, rank the presidents. You know, for years, Truman was a failure. Guess what, everybody? Now he's considered one of the greats. And it was about 20 years later. So I'll be darned if Harry didn't nail that as well. Yeah, today everybody loves Harry Truman. He's probably the only American politician that both Democrats and Republicans like. Everybody loves Harry. So he was unpopular, Rhonda, but he knew what it would take, and he had trust, confidence in the American people. And I'll be darned if we didn't come around to seeing the wisdom of making decisions according to, quote unquote, is it the right thing to do?
Okay, well, thank you for that answer. And on that note, talking about Truman as one of the greatest presidents, please join us on Monday, September 13th at 7 o'clock. And you will hear about ranking of the presidents from best to worst and how you rank them. So thanks, everybody. See you in a couple weeks.
Thank you, Rhonda. And let me ask everybody as you're signing off to do two things. I'd like all of you to think about who your favorite top 5 presidents are and who the worst 5 are. And I'm going to ask everybody to throw it out. Then I'll give you the ranking list and all the debates that we do. And the last thing, if anybody's interested, my email is rwatson@lynn.edu, or Rhonda has it. I lecture on cruises, and I'm leading a Jewish heritage cruise on the Danube next June. Prague, Vienna, Budapest. Karen has already packed, I believe. I've already packed. We are ready to go. And I'm going to lecture every day, and I have a dozen world-class Jewish heritage sites. Or if you don't want that, we have a dozen non-Jewish heritage sites, foodie tours, museums, art galleries, bike rides, on a luxurious ship down one of the world's truly most beautiful rivers. And every day I'm going to give you the story of the city that we're going to go to, its history, and then we're going to walk around together and have a wonderful time. And then at night, we're going to eat local foods, drink local wine, and a lot of it. So holler at me if questions. Rhonda, thanks as always. I'll see everybody in September. Thank you.
Thank you. Happy